KSPS television. You're going to make me work for this tonight, aren't you? I can just feel it. First of all, I am extremely proud to be the MC for this. And I will go as quickly as I can so we can get to the main event. But I want to thank you all for being part of this event today for any number of reasons. Not the least of which being, it's always great to spend time with people who get to spend time with each other. And more importantly, for the folks at the NMAC, who have been extremely generous in letting us do this here. So give them a round of applause. Now, for those of you who have telephones, semaphore, Morse code, or any other device designed to get in touch with someone else, turn it off, put it in your pocket, please, and thank you. The management expressly prohibited. Okay, so now, we are thrilled to welcome Nick Sheedy, lead genealogist for the wildly popular PBS program, Finding Your Roots with Henry Louis H. Jr. Nick has traveled all the way from Montana with his lovely family, and we're delighted to have him here. You can stand up. It's okay. Nick will be discussing his work in the fascinating process of exploring family histories. Thank you to Dick Jensen of the Westerners of Spokane, Corral, and cousins. And cousins. And we will also have plenty of time for questions, so feel free to engage. Let's give a warm welcome to Nick. Come on over.
Stand up on the stage instead of behind the podium, except that lights me. Maybe this is a better idea. Okay.
We need the mic.
Before I introduce myself, I would like to say thank you to KSPS, not as lead genealogist for Finding Your Roots, but as a father of 4 little boys. And if any of you have children or grandchildren, or you know any young people, you know it's a different world today. We don't have 3 channels that come over the air. We have this enormous quagmire of choices between online media and YouTube videos and all of these different channels, and there is one channel that my wife Chelsea and I trust without reservation, where we can turn on whatever's playing right now, or we can hand the kids the controller and say, watch whatever you want, and that is PBS Kids. And so as a father, I thank everybody who supports your local PBS station to bring great programming like PBS Kids, but also Finding Your Roots and all of the other great programming that we have on PBS. And so I really appreciate that with public television. My name is Nick Sheedy, and for the past 10 seasons, 12 years, I have been the genealogist for Finding Your Roots. I came on board during season 2, that was way back in 2012, as the Associate Genealogist under Johni Cerny, who was our Chief Genealogist. And Johni was just an amazing mentor, friend, and one of the leading genealogists in the world, and I was very blessed to have her as a mentor. She passed away in February of 2020, and I became lead genealogist. We hired a couple more lead genealogists. And so with that team going forward, the dynamic changed when the world turned upside down for a year or two with the production schedule. But Finding Your Roots persevered. There was a short time there where we were like, are we going to be able to film interviews? Are we going to be able to travel? But we, through 2020, we continued to conduct the research, and we started banking scripts, and when we were able to travel and do the interviews, season 7 ended up airing just like every other season. And so season 7, 8, 9, and 10, and 11, I served as lead genealogist. So this upcoming season, it's about to air, season 11, and I'm kind of embarrassed because they just announced the lineup. I'm not allowed to say who the guests are for the upcoming show until they release the lineup. It's just like a day or two ago they finally said, here's the trailers for season 11, and I don't know all the 22 or 24 guests that we have coming up. But it will start airing again in January, and season 12 is in the works. They have started production for season 12, but I'm not staying on board for season 12. So I'm very happy to be able to spend more time with my family, and it was mentioned I do live in the Flathead Valley in Montana. We live in Columbia Falls, and I grew up just south of there in Big Fork on Flathead Lake. And I was born in John Day, Oregon, and so when we would go back to see family in John Day, we would usually drive through Spokane, so I'm familiar with this area. And then through high school and college years, I went to college at Linfield in McMinnville, Oregon. Again, I often drive through Spokane. But I do have roots in the Spokane area. And I do want to give a shout out to my cousin Maggie. Where are you, Maggie? Maggie Crabtree and I are third cousins. And Maggie helped spearhead this event tonight, so I really appreciate that. But Maggie and I are third cousins, and our great-grandmothers were sisters. And so our great-great-grandparents were Frederick Sylvanus Phillips and Mary Elizabeth Whelan, and they came to Washington Territory in 1886. And they first settled at Chewelah for a short time, then Caldwell. Fred Phillips served as a clerk for Stevens County, and then as an assessor. And they moved up to Northport in the 1890s. And I don't remember exactly which year it was, but I'm told that they staked the first homestead west of the Columbia when that area opened up to homesteading. And the Phillips Ranch is still in the family. And when I would go from Montana to college, I would often make a loop up through Northport and see my great-uncle Forrest Sheedy, and my great-great-uncle, my great-grandmother's youngest brother, is still living, Uncle Mike Phillips. And so I got to know this area pretty well, and also visit with some of these guys that had some family stories to tell. And one of them was, and I grew up knowing that I had an ancestor that was involved with this railroad, the Great Northern Railroad. We had a stool that was in our shop, like an old heavy cast iron stool that said Great Northern Railway on it. But I never knew the guy's name. And so when I was in college, I stopped by and I saw my Uncle Forey, who was a retired high school teacher who taught German and English. And he said, well, you're up there in Flathead. He goes, well, your great-great-granddad built the west end of the High Line. I didn't know what the High Line is, but in my neck of the woods, the High Line is the west end of the Great Northern Railway, the northernmost transcontinental railway in the U.S. And in Glacier Park area, Whitefish area, everything's Great Northern this and Great Northern that. And it turns out my great-great-grandfather supervised the construction of the new west end of the High Line. In 1904, they rebuilt the railroad that went from Columbia Falls, where I live. This rail line is only about half a mile from our house, and we hear the whistles blow when it crosses Half Moon Road, down the road. But it wasn't until years later, when I started doing genealogy research and actually documenting my family, that I learned that my great-great-grandfather, Robert Herman Sheedy, brought our Sheedy family to Washington Territory in 1889. And this was the year that Washington became a state. And they first settled over in Shelton. And he supervised construction of the Satsip and Peninsular Railways, which accessed the virgin timber on the Olympic Peninsula. They worked for the Simpson Lumber Company. Well, in 1896, he took a job with the Spokane Falls and Northern and completed the construction of the railroad bridge across the Columbia River at Northport. So that's what brought my Sheedy family to Northport. And during this time, the Sheedys and the Phillipses happened to live next door to each other. And so my great-grandparents knew each other as kids, like teenagers, maybe 10 to 12, 15. But my great-great-grandparents wanted their kids to have a better education, so they moved to Spokane in 1900. And their house is still standing. It's on Mission Avenue. It's like a little craftsman. It's on the block between Division and Ruby. So, you drive north, like half a block from where they used to live. So my great-grandfather, Robin Carl Sheedy, graduated from the old Central High School here in Spokane in 1902. And he had a bit of an adventure. He went to Washington Agricultural College, which is now Wazoo, for I think a year, year and a half. And this is a family story that I can't verify. I actually called the university and they actually said that they rather doubt that it happened. But the story goes that my great-grandfather, and we called him Bompy, that was his nickname. Bompy and his future brother-in-law, Forrest Phillips, were roommates. And apparently to make a little extra money on the side, they had a trap line on a creek that went through campus, and they were tanning some stinky pelts in their college dorm room. And the story I was told was the dean confiscated them, and I'm told now that there was no dean at that time, but it could have been like the dorm master. Anyway, somebody confiscated their stinky pelts that they were tanning in the dorm facility, and as a retaliation, they hooked up a pulley system, and they removed the furniture from this guy's third-story room, and they set his furniture up on the roof of a neighboring building. And for that, they were asked not to come back. So Uncle Forrest Phillips, fortunately, said, all right, well, I guess I'm not going to go to college. So he went back up to Northport, was a land agent for a while, and got a taste of real estate. He ended up going to California in 1906 and bought a bunch of real estate after a big earthquake. Made real estate take a nosedive, and he made a buttload of money. And Uncle Forrest Phillips was kind of known for making and losing $1 million 3 different times. But it was very fortunate that after my grandfather, Carl Philip Sheedy, got out of the Army, Uncle Forrest Phillips had a real estate office and got my grandpa involved in real estate. And they were very successful. But in the meantime, my great-grandfather, Robin Carl Sheedy, not going to go back to college, so he goes up to Alaska for 2 years. Jumped a steamer from up to Skagway, went over the pass to Dawson, down the Yukon River, and he was hired on by the Tanana Valley Mines Railroad as a professional hunter. And spent 2 years in Fairbanks. And one of the things he did up there over the winter, he got the contract to deliver mail to Fairbanks, Alaska by dog sled. Went from Fairbanks to Valdez and back. It's 400 miles one way by dog sled. He took a camera with him, a little brownie camera. We have photographs of this. But he comes back to Northport after he's done, and he's working for Great Northern Railway, which his dad was the roadmaster at that time, out of the Spokane office. And if you don't know, down at Riverside Park, there's a clock tower. That clock tower is the original tower of the Great Northern Railway Depot, which purchased the Spokane Falls and Northern. Spokane Falls and Northern Railway was entirely owned by Great Northern. And so my great-great-grandfather's office would have been in that old depot when he was there. And he supervised construction of the rail lines up to Molson, up to Wymer, BC, and on to Nelson, and the Colbert Cutoff. He rebuilt the bridge at Marcus, I think it was, which is now inundated by the reservoir, Roosevelt Lake. But my great-grandfather came back, and for a time he worked for the railroad under his dad. And that's when he rekindled a relationship with my soon-to-be great-grandmother, Florence Phillips. And so here's another family story. And this is one that I only know because I used to come through Northport when I was going back and forth to college. And my Uncle Forrest Sheedy told me that the railroad bridge across the Columbia, built in 1896, was for many years the only bridge. Otherwise you had to take a little ferry if you were on your horse and wagon or you're driving a car. But if there was no trains coming, you could drive across the railroad bridge. So there was a party. And my great-grandfather sees my great-grandmother and says, let's take a walk across the bridge. So they get about halfway across the Columbia River. He says, I heard you're engaged to that Leon Savage. She goes, yeah, let me see that ring. She holds out her hand. He took the ring off of her finger. He threw it to the Columbia River. And he said, you're not going to marry Leon Savage. You're going to marry me. And I guess that's how he proposed. Now fast forward, the story I'm told, and it kind of falls together. 35 years later, my grandfather, Carl Philip Sheedy, is in California. His dad worked in construction all over the country. He was pouring the north anchor. He was a concrete man. He was pouring the north anchor for the Golden Gate Bridge in the 30s. And they were in the Bay Area at some times, but they were all over the country. My grandfather was in Newark, California when he was drafted in World War II. Newly married, baby on the way. He has to report to Camp Roberts in California, who happens to be the CO at Camp Roberts. Well, when Leon Savage got dumped, he went off and joined up, served in World War I, and made a career in the military. And I found him on censuses. He was in Panama and all over. Colonel Leon Savage was the commanding officer of Camp Roberts when my grandfather showed up for duty. And my great-grandfather wrote a letter to Leon Savage asking him to please place my grandfather in a non-combat role. And my grandfather ended up serving as a medic. He probably would have been a conscientious objector. And he went into World War II as a medic and unarmed. And as a Quaker and a pacifist, he refused to bear arms during World War II. But fortunately, this crazy favor from a kid from Northport, he didn't have to shoot at anybody, and he had a non-combat role. That's not to say he didn't see action. He did see action in North Africa, in Sicily, and Italy, and he received the Bronze Star and the Silver Star for Valor in the field and a Purple Heart. But it goes to show how little decisions made that you might never know about end up having a ripple effect down through the generations. And so that's my connection to northeastern Washington. I have deep roots here. And my great-great-grandfather, Robert Herman Sheedy, was the general roadmaster for Great Northern Railway in Spokane Falls in Northern from 1904 up until his retirement in 1920. And so he would have overseen all of the rail lines and kind of been the general manager of this division, which would have extended from Montana halfway to Seattle and on up to Waimea, Nelson, BC. And so it's really, I have a lot of gratitude for the opportunities that railroading and this community afforded our family, because my great-great-grandfather was an orphaned immigrant. He was born in Westnau, Poland. He was Germanic, but his mother died in a hotel fire when he was 7. His 2 older siblings died when they were young. He grew up as an only child. His father brought him to Canada in 1869 when he was 12. His father froze to death while hunting. So at the age of 12, he was orphaned in Ontario, Canada, came to America when he was 15, lied when he was 17, said he was 19, he joined up with the Army, came west and railroaded and had a long and successful career. And he retired from Great Northern Railway in 1920 and went down to Los Angeles, where most of his kids, 2 of his kids were by that time. In doing that family history, I've been poking around in a lot of the old newspapers around the Spokane area and found lots of mentions of that. And so when we do this sort of research, genealogy research, I would say 80–85% of the records that you might find are not digitized, they're not online. You know, they might be microfilm. They might be in an archive somewhere. A lot of the newspapers, more and more of the newspapers are getting digitized. But so many of those records are only accessible in archives on paper still. And so when we do this sort of research for finding roots, it's not like when you're working on your own family tree. You might have years to work on it. You hit a brick wall, and you say, it's too hard to set it down, maybe come back to it in a few years. We have deadlines for finding your roots. We might have a few weeks to flesh out and document an entire pedigree and do it well enough that we can sniff out a story and then do some deep dives to find the documents to be able to tell that story. And so it's really remarkable with the Finding Your Roots team what we're able to pull together in a remarkably short period of time. And if you watch the show, you know, there's all of these amazing stories. Well, we only would research and document maybe 1 or 2 stories on each side of the person's family. You don't hear about all of the dead ends we run into, because if you do family history research, you know what sort of brick walls you run into and what kind of dead ends you have to deal with. And everybody has those in their family trees. Most of the celebrities who are guests on Finding Your Roots come from humble beginnings and regular backgrounds, and their ancestors left the same sorts of records and documents that anyone's ancestors leave. And so one question I often get asked, for Finding Roots, how do you go about this sort of research? Well, you go about this sort of research the same exact way that you would go about your own family tree research. You start with the known, and you delve into the unknown. For guests at Finding Your Roots, or if I'm working for private clients, I give them a questionnaire. They tell me what they know. Who are your parents? Who are your grandparents? Maybe some great-grandparents. What family stories do you have? Do you want those family stories verified? You know? Are there any family mysteries? You know, there's an unknown paternity somewhere in the family tree, or there's a question mark out here about, you know, there's a story that you know, is questionable. And I think we all have some of those. And so with a lot of the guests for Finding Your Roots, it's the same story. Sometimes the guests for Finding Your Roots come to us with questions or a family mystery. And sometimes they're like, I just want to know where did I come from? Or they have an idea. One of the guests for Finding Your Roots coming up, Glenn Close, you'll see that, was it Glenn Close? Now I can't remember which guest it was, but she had an idea that she was Irish. And she had this identity, she was Irish. Well, when we dug into the family tree, we found out, yeah, she has a few Irish ancestors, but she's more German and more English. You know, it's the way a person identifies with what they're told about the family they know may not accurately represent who all of their ancestors actually were. And so it's interesting to me sometimes how some of the guests for Finding Your Roots, like so many people, don't know anything about their ancestors beyond grandparents, maybe the name of a great-grandparent or two. And that's across the board. Our African-American guests, our white guests, a lot of our Asian guests knew very little about any of their roots. Especially the immigrant generation just didn't talk about the past. And we see that also with a lot of Jewish guests. They didn't talk about any ancestors beyond that immigrant, you know, before that immigrant generation. And so for Finding Your Roots, it's always, it's a journey of discovery, just like you're working on your own family tree. You know, how much do you know about your own family tree? And some people, it's grandparents, maybe a few great-grandparents. I was blessed growing up to have had a personal relationship with 4 of my great-grandparents. And my great-granddad, Sam, lived to be 2 weeks shy of 100. I was 26 when he died. And his grandfather lived to be 92. He was 27 when that man died. He was born in 1835 and fought 7 years under Napoleon III during the Franco-Prussian Wars. So I got second-hand stories from a man born nearly 200 years ago. So I was very blessed in that way. Most people don't get quite that deep and have the benefit of having those sorts of family stories handed down. And so I was really blessed, especially during my college years when I started to get a little more interested in family history, to come through Northport and visit my great-uncle Forrest Sheedy, who was a very bright man, and Uncle Mike Phillips and his wife Chick, and Aunt Chick did an amazing amount of research on the Phillips family for us. She just handed me this folder about this thick, and it was a pedigree of the whole family, and we were really blessed because Grandma Phillips was Quaker, and the Quakers kept amazingly great records, very easy to document, just kind of all falls together. So I got very spoiled very quickly in my own family tree research. But so many people have a relative in their family who's done the family tree and they're happy to share. And that's one of the things that I really enjoy connecting with cousins, distant cousins, is sharing what I found. And oftentimes, if the other distant cousins have conducted family history research, they'll share what they find in dovetails and build the family tree. And so I feel very blessed in that way. But for finding your roots, I'm sure that some of you may have some questions. We're going to open up to questions and answers. If you have specific questions about finding your roots, I can answer questions about anything that was made public on during the episodes that aired. And if you have any questions about general family history research, I can try to, point you in the right direction or explain how you go about a certain type of research or give you some pointers. But if it's really specific to your family, I may not be able to answer in particular without doing a little preliminary research and not knowing, some of the details about your particular family. What's interesting is every family tree is unique to you. You have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-great-grandparents. That combination, you only share with your full siblings. No one else in the world. But here's what's interesting. As you go back through those generations, you start connecting to your 2nd cousins and 3rd cousins and 5th cousins. And as you go back to 5th, 8th, 10th great-grandparents, you have like 1,000 10th great-grandparents. If you were to map out all of their living descendants, there's probably millions of them. And so, very quickly, your family tree goes far beyond comprehension. And so, while it's very specific to you when you look at your pedigree, as you start looking down the other branches, we're all connected. And that's one of the fascinating things about family history is, as a genealogist, you start connecting the dots and you realize, why am I even doing this? We are all so closely related. Why does it even matter? And it does matter because we like those stories and we like to have a personal connection. We like to feel like we belong. And I think one of the reasons why genealogy is so popular is that it gives us not only a sense of belonging, but like, this is my tribe. And this tribe belongs to me, but I also belong to it. Everybody wants to find those connections and establish a sense of belonging. And I think that's something that's very basic, a very basic human need. It's almost tribal. We want to have a sense of belonging. We want to have a sense of, I belong here. And so with that, let's open it up to some questions. Do you want to call? Oh.
But we may not need it. Go ahead and raise your hand, and then we also can turn this off if you want to see a while.
Let's do that.
And we have a second mic?
You won't need the mic for the audience.
You don't think so? Okay, then I'm taking that here.
All right.
Okay, Sharon Stone. Okay.
Oh, Sharon Stone? Oh, it was Sharon Stone. Sharon Stone, yeah, she thought she was an Irish girl. She was like 2 little branches that were Irish. So it's funny how people might develop a sense of identity, especially cultural identity, when they know a certain branch of the family, but they don't know any of the other branches. So I'll turn this back on.
We've got a question here, right here in the front.
Yes, sir.
This is our first, okay? All right.
Yes, with the solution of cold cases and criminal cases,
Yeah.
I have been told that far fewer people are submitting their DNA samples for Ancestry.com or Family Tree DNA and things of this sort. Is that diminution of interest, so to speak, or to say the diminution of sample affecting the work of your program?
The short answer would be no. And I'm not sure how much these cold cases have influenced people deciding whether or not to test. If you're a criminal and you might be connected to a rape or murder, I think you'll probably think twice about testing your DNA and getting it into a public database. But for most people, they not only get into the databases, but one of the big databases, GEDmatch, is one where if you tested Ancestry, 23andMe, MyHeritage, there's lots of places to test your DNA. Though if you look at the numbers, they've gone up and they've kind of plateaued. But there's tens of millions of people who have tested. And it continues to grow. So I'm not sure if the general population's not testing because of that. But the databases that allow access to law enforcement give people the option. whether or not they want to allow their DNA to be accessible for law enforcement purposes. But my colleague, C.C. Moore, is heavily involved in a lot of those cold cases and working in criminal investigations. And the databases are invaluable for that. You know, they solve crimes that they would have never even, it would have never even been possible.
Is the submission international, and are the rates similar in various nations or areas?
No, far more people in the United States have submitted DNA, and I think it's because we're a nation of immigrants, and we're more interested in family history and where we came from. If you look at rates in England or elsewhere in Europe, far fewer people have tested, and that's largely because some countries it's illegal, like France. I mean, I think it may be legal now, but for a long time, in some countries it was simply illegal to test your DNA for, you know, fun, for genealogical purposes, and put it in some public database. Some European countries, most European countries are, they're a lot more strict about privacy and protecting your privacy for your own good, even if you would like to submit your DNA. And so I do have cousins that in Germany, distant cousins, or maybe I track people down for people of interest that I want to test DNA, say even for my own purposes. If it's illegal in that country, well, you still send them a DNA kit if they're willing to test. You just FedEx it to them, and you say it's the genealogy records, and they'll send it back. And we've done that for a few other countries as well. But the reason why you don't have as high a testing in other countries is because people just aren't as interested in knowing their family history, because they live in the same place where their ancestors have lived for generations and centuries, and I don't think that they have quite the drive to know where they came from, because they still live in the same area.
Would it be true,
yeah.
Western Hemisphere generally?
I'm not sure. I don't know. I do know that there are some countries that, for instance, I met a guy in Montana. His adopted children are from Haiti, and he was interested. Well, could we take a DNA test and, you know, find some of their blood relatives? And the answer is yes, you could, if those blood relatives happen to have tested. And why wouldn't they have tested in Haiti? Well, people aren't interested. It's not a high priority. They're dirt poor. And so, you know, just for fun, I kind of looked at, well, how many people from Haiti, you know, who live in Haiti have tested DNA, and, you know, it's minuscule. And so there's lots of reasons and variables why somebody might not test their DNA, you know, around the world. We have very low test rates in Asia, you know, and so some of our Asian guests who have tested DNA, they end up not matching a lot of people in the system because not a lot of people from China or Korea have tested their DNA.
So we've got a question here next.
I wanted to make a comment on the medics thing.
Yeah.
My grandfather was a medics in World War I. My son was a medics in Afghanistan. And they both noted the same thing, that Red Cross that they wore or had on their equipment, most people, most enemies think that that's a target.
Yeah.
So they really get away from that.
No, you don't.
Being shot at.
Right. And
So,
my grandpa Corral, as a medic and a staff sergeant, he was, as an enlisted man, most enlisted men don't wear sidearm. He could have worn a sidearm. He chose not to. He chose to go into combat unarmed.
and they do now.
Yeah. Boy, they do. But as a pacifist, he did not want to be placed in a position where he might have a choice to shoot at another person or not. And he chose not to. And so, you know, I asked my boys, how brave do you have to be to go into combat?
Yeah, right. So I do have a question about Native American. I heard that there was a very good database on Native American.
For DNA?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
records?
Right.
Both?
For DNA.
For DNA?
Yeah.
So a lot of the tribes frown on testing DNA.
Right.
So when DNA first became a thing, a few tribes thought, this is fantastic. It's going to be a really easy way for us to document and prove our blood quantum. And then a few people tested, and it did not quite line up to what the paper trail says. So every tribe has what they call a blood quantum, or every member of a tribe has what's it called, they call it blood quantum, 7/8 or 3/16 or whatever. And then the tribe has a criteria. The tribe sets its own criteria, but the Bureau of Indian Affairs is the one that verifies, do you have enough blood degree to qualify for this tribal membership? And when people started testing DNA, this is what I've heard, that the DNA was far less than what the paper trail said. And so many tribes said, I don't think we're going to do that. But many tribes are very protective of their heritage, their traditions, and the tribal records simply, they're kept tight. And so the research is very difficult unless you're a tribal member.
Right. Yeah. My grandfather grew up on a reservation, but then broke away from it, which I think was very common in the early 1900s. And nothing ever shows up.
If you take a DNA test, the Native American DNA should show if you have
A DNA.
the Native American admixture should show up if you have any documentable ancestors. But,
So we're going to go to
Yep.
this gentleman here.
Will you be working as a private contractor with Finding Your Roots?
So my work for Finding Your Roots for the past 12 years was as a I have a new phone. I promise, I thought that I turned that.
That was my Galloway family.
Does anybody else have Scotland Brave as a ringtone? I'm going to turn my phone entirely off. It is a brand new phone. I don't even know how to turn this thing on.
I was just wondering if your leading was going to be an opportunity here as a private contractor.
So for Finding Your Roots, I worked as a contractor. When I came on board working with Johni Cerny back in 2012, we contracted with Finding Your Roots, and we also worked on private client research as well. Finding Your Roots was our largest client. And so that would have been from 2012 up to early 2020. 2020 forward, I continued as an independent contractor for Finding Your Roots. I took on very few outside projects. Most of the projects I would work on outside of Finding Your Roots were either academic, a researcher writing a book, larger institutions who had some family history research, general historical research, and then some probate cases.
So you won't be opposed if they call you up and
No.
ask for your service?
No. And now I will be taking more private clients. But over the past 12 years, most of my clients were either probate cases, large institutions, some museums, and I did a lot of pro bono work for museums and historical societies and things like that.
So we've got someone back here, Mr. Dean, I think.
She was before me.
Was she before you? Okay. Which one of you was first? This one? Yeah, okay.
No idea.
This beautiful blonde back here was next. That's you.
Oh,
That's
the
you.
hair is actually thin. I was just going to comment on, my family and my husband's family are very different. Americans from way back. But his family stayed in one little place in Pennsylvania. When I go back there, they've got generations in the cemetery and, this. My family started out in the East, went to the Midwest, went to Oklahoma, and we don't have a clue. Really. I had the blood test done, and it said that we were mostly Irish and Scottish and a little bit of this and a little bit of that. But I couldn't figure out why in the world it said Scandinavian. And then, how long were the Vikings messing around?
You're barking up the right tree. And I can relate. My dad's side of the family, the Phillips branch, the Sheedy branch, my grandma Betty's great-grandparents were all California pioneers. people with itchy feet, and they kept moving west every generation until they hit the coast. They couldn't go any farther, and then they kind of bounced inward, inland a little bit. But my mother's family, some branches of my mom's family, they landed in Connecticut in 1635. They moved to Ohio in 1816. And that's where my mom was born, in that same hometown. 2 hometowns in 400 years. And so my mom grew up with kind of that Midwestern, this is where our roots are. The Shelby, Ohio, the city library is the Marvin Library, the genealogy room is the Marvin room, and that's my family. But my dad's side of the family, like yours, bounced around, itchy feet, looking for greener pastures. Those were the miners and the real estate speculators and the folks looking for greener pastures. When you test DNA, and my dad's done this like you, my dad's DNA comes up 16% Norwegian. I've documented every line back at least to the mid-1700s, some lines back much further. I have 0 ancestors from Norway. Right? And so, like you, I'm scratching my head. I have a lot of ancestry in the Hebrides, in the outer Hebrides in Scotland, northern England, coastal England on both sides, northern Germany along the coast, Friesland, which is now part of the Netherlands, northern Poland, and these are places where the Vikings raided and colonized. And if you were to test DNA from anybody who lives in those areas today and has deep roots in coastal northern England, the Highlands of Scotland, parts of Ireland, the north coast of Europe, they will probably come back with 10 to 15% Scandinavian DNA. And what it tells you is, if you go back 1,000 years, the base population, the common ancestors for, people generally in that region, have a lot of Viking admixture. As another example, if you were to take DNA sample from somebody from Puerto Rico, on average, people from Puerto Rico have like 10 to 15% Native American DNA. There hasn't been a full-blooded Native American in Puerto Rico since the late 1600s, maybe early 1700s. But what does it tell you? It tells you that the base population, the base population from whom all modern Puerto Ricans descend, 12% of them would have been Native American. But because it's across the board, that admixture is passed on in perpetuity. And so when you take a DNA test and you look at that, that pie chart, what percentage of your DNA came from what part of the world, it's supposed to represent or estimate what percentage of your ancestors lived in what part of the world around 500 years ago. That's what it's supposed to represent. And so if your ancestors lived in a place 500 years ago that was heavily influenced through DNA from another part of the world, and the Vikings are a great example. I think that a lot of people in Northern Europe, coastal Europe, parts of Scotland, parts of Ireland, parts of England will show a lot of Norwegian or Scandinavian DNA. And if you scratch your head a little bit, you hit the nail on the head. It's some Viking influence.
That's like a Genghis Khan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Dean's question is?
Once you figure out that great-grandpa or great-great-grandpa came from Germany or France or England or Italy, what sources of information are available in European countries?
So I'll answer that in 2 parts. First of all, when you get back to that immigrant generation, if you want to jump over the pond and you start doing foreign research, you have to document everyone in that immigrant generation. So you might have an ancestor who came over, and what you hope is a married couple came over with a group of kids, because that family constellation is going to be easier to find on a ship manifest all together in a group. If you have the husband and the wife's names, 2 or 3 children born in the old country, when you find that combination on a ship's manifest and if they all line up, you can be more confident you found the right family group. if somebody immigrated on their own, you know, single guy in his 20s, you know, a single woman who's 22 years old, her name's Mary Smith, you're looking for one person who came alone on a ship, no family with her, that's a lot harder to know for sure that you found the right person. So, in order to connect the dots between the immigrant generation and where did they come from, you want to find as many records for the immigrant generation as you can, and that includes all of the relatives. Maybe not just your ancestors, but maybe the siblings of your ancestors. Any of those records that might give you an exact birth date and an exact birthplace, because records in Europe are very local specific. You don't have state-issued birth, death, and marriage certificates. They're all issued pretty much at the town level or commune level, very local registrars. And so you have to know a very specific location in order to focus the research. What records in the United States might give you that information? Well, if you find an arrival record or a naturalization record, a World War I draft card, a World War II draft card, a marriage record, anything that says where that immigrant was born, if it gives you a specific town, now you know where to focus that research. If you get an exact birth date on any record in the United States, if you find that person's birth record, the exact birth date in the old country, now you connected that dot. My great-great-grandfather, Robert Herman Sheedy, roadmaster for Great Northern Railway, was born June 6, 1852. Family story said he was born in Danzig, which is now Gdansk, Poland. He was not born in Danzig, which is the city. Gdansk is a big city. He was born in a small town about 15 miles outside of Danzig, which is now Gdansk. But when I found his birth record, instead of Robert Herman Sheedy, it was Herman Robert Scheidt, S-C-H-E-I-D-T. But the exact right birth date, I had a pretty good feeling that I found the right guy. The birth date's lined up, he's in the right place, the name seems correct, and then the family story was his mother died in a fire. When the family's inn caught fire, I found his mother's death record. Died in a horrific fire. So an exact birth date was the key for me in my own family tree to make sure, realize, you know, I found the record finally. And after I made that connection, boom, 4 more generations showed up in the German Lutheran records. So you have to know the exact city to focus on. But what's really nice, for the most part, in Europe, there aren't not great record losses. Ireland, you do have some record losses, civil record losses. But for the most part, records are kept at a very local level, a local registrar, whether it's a city, a town, civil registration district in France, and in France and Italy, they're called communes. That's the local district. If you go to Ireland, it's going to be, for civil records, you want the civil parish name, and for church records, you want the church parish name. The same for England. Often in England, the church parish and the civil parish have the same name and they line up. In Ireland, they kind of overlap and sometimes they're not even the same name. But you need to profile that immigrant family group well enough that you get some exact birth dates and a place to focus. But it's just hit or miss what records have been digitized and what records are easily accessible online. Otherwise, you have to hire a phone researcher. So, for instance, a lot of the communes in France, a lot of the departments in France have digitized all of their civil records, all of their church records. They're at your fingertips. It's like you can flip open the book and you're just thumbing through the books, as if you're sitting in the archive room and you're thumbing through the physical pages. They're at your fingertips. Some Italian records are digitized, and some are not. If they are, they're probably digitized off of microfilm familysearch.org, which is the Family History Library's website. But there's also databases at Ancestry.com. There's a few other websites. France, Germany, Ireland, depends where you're looking. There's often a repository that has digitized whatever records might be available. Ireland, it used to be very difficult. Catholic records were kept by the local parish, and if you wanted to see if your records of your ancestor existed, you had to know the parish name, write a letter, like a stamp, send it to the priest, hope that he reads your letter, hope that he's interested enough to write you back and say, yes, I found your people in the parish books, and transcribe it by hand probably. Well, the National Library of Ireland took it upon themselves, and they partnered with the Catholic Church and the various dioceses. They've digitized like 95% of all of the Irish Catholic records. They're now at your fingertips online. They're not fully indexed or digitized. Shouldn't be digitized, but digitally transcribed. You can't like type in a keyword and just search for names. But if you know the parish and the approximate birth year somebody was born, you can go and you can look in those parish birth, death, and marriage books and thumb through them page by page, you know, chronologically. And they went from being totally inaccessible to being at your fingertips if you have internet access. And so it really depends where your people came from, how accessible those records are. If it's Jewish research and it's Eastern Europe, hire somebody. And for finding your roots, we have our go-to people, whether it's in Ukraine or Poland or Belarus. You know, we have some people that we can go to, and then they have connections. And in Ukraine for years, it's kind of been like a cartel. It didn't matter who we contacted. Like, it always seemed to go around to the same small group of people that kind of greased each other's palms or something. But there are professional genealogists in some of these countries that you can hire. In Asia, we often had a hard time finding professional genealogists, and so we would often use academic connections to find people to look up the records, the jokos, and those family books that sometimes go back hundreds of generations. And so when it comes to the foreign research, it's very hit or miss, I should say, depending on the country. And oftentimes you have to hire an expert in that country in order to access records that you simply can't access online. I'll start calling.
I have a question about people who have discovered something so horrific about their family that it's created post-traumatic stress. And does that happen very often? I thought I knew everything about my family, and about 8 months ago, my first cousin took a DNA test, and we discovered there was this horrible, horrible story in our family. And it's just sort of rocked everything that we've ever known. And of course, everybody that would have known about what had happened are gone. So we don't have anybody we can talk to about it. But does that happen a lot?
Oh, a lot more than you might imagine. Yes, and the DNA tests that people are taking are bringing that to light. I should caution anybody who's interested in or thinking about taking a DNA test, be prepared, you might find something that you're not anticipating. There are, if you're on Facebook, there's some Facebook groups for people that have discovered, you know, family history that they had no idea. Some people take a DNA test thinking they're going to get their pie chart and it's going to be a fun thing, and they find out their dad isn't their biological father. You know, stuff like that. Or they have siblings they didn't know about. And sometimes it's not a rosy story. For finding your roots, we've had a few guests who have tested DNA. We've dug into some research, and all of a sudden there's a surprise with the DNA. And there have been, you know, we've had some forums where this question's come up, and we have a protocol for on finding your roots. When that happens, production stops, and Professor Gates reaches out to the guest and says, hey, we have the DNA's revealed something that the paper trail does not. It's a surprise, and it's the guest's choice whether they want to move forward or not. You know, finding your roots is not Jerry Springer. It's not a gotcha. And if you watch some of those episodes where there has been a surprise, LL Cool J was one. His mother was adopted, and she didn't know growing up. She had a hint because some cousin blurted something out one time, and it was always in the back of her mind. But through DNA, we solved that mystery, and it ended up being a pretty amazing story, and there were some amazing connections. But we find that with finding your roots. And Facebook groups, there's one called DNA Detectives that my colleague C.C. Moore has started. There's like 200,000 members now. It's dedicated to people who have an unknown paternity, or they were adopted, or they took a DNA test and surprise, they don't know who their biological father is, or there's a family mystery. There's other Facebook groups out there that are similar to that. Some of them are more like looking for a search angel to help them sort out the DNA matches and solve this family mystery. Some of the Facebook groups are more of a support network. Like, I experienced this, it's traumatic, and how do you deal with this? And I talked to Cece more, we went back to Cumberland, Maryland for a special reveal with Dr. Gates last April, and there's actually very few therapists who specialize in that sort of trauma therapy. My wife's a psychologist, so she specializes in that sort of, you know, people who've dealt with trauma, but there's very few therapists who actually specialize in that. So it's kind of a new field because it's a new technology, but you're not alone.
Okay, so our next person is here.
Okay.
And the person in front of her is next after that.
Okay.
I have a question about the show. Do you get to interview the celebrities, or does Dr. Gates interview them and you get the information that way? As a private contractor, I just wonder how much contact you have with the celebrities.
Sure. So there's a process to it. So the production for a season runs for a whole year. So season 11, which is going to air in July, we wrapped up production in June. And it started last August, over a year ago. And so we have a lineup of guests. Sometimes we have a list that's twice as long as the number of guests that end up appearing in the show. And who ends up in the show for that season sometimes is just as arbitrary as whose schedule lines up where we can facilitate an interview. But as we go along, we document, the genealogist will document the family tree, we'll snip out stories, you have an idea where a story might be, and there's a team assigned to each guest. And so as we document the family tree and start doing deeper dives, the genealogist and the researchers gather the documents which allow us to tell the stories. The producer who's assigned to that guest chooses which stories we're going to focus on. Usually we get 2 stories for the paternal side, 2 stories for the maternal side for each guest. That's what we like. The producers actually write a script for Professor Gates, but it's a one-sided script because the guest doesn't know what's going to be revealed to him or her. And so you can anticipate how the guest might react, or hope the guest might react, but you don't know exactly what they're going to say or what dialogue is spontaneously going to happen during that interview. So Professor Gates has a script that he's working off of that corresponds with the Book of Life that's handed to the guest. The Book of Life, if any of you have ever put together your own family tree, or you might have hired a family researcher, you get a report, it's nothing like that. The Book of Life is just more like a scrapbook. It's photographs, it's specific documents that are key to moving the story along. But Professor Gates is telling the story using the documents that are in that Book of Life. So we have a few key documents that introduce the guest to the ancestors that we're going to tell stories about. But Professor Gates is working off of a script to tell this story, and then the guest reacts, and they have a spontaneous dialogue about it. And what you see on screen is the result of this interview process. And we love surprising stories, but at the same time, if you hit your guest over the head with a hammer and they're stunned and speechless, there's not going to be much of a reaction or an interview. And we have had a few guests. Earl Williams, he was really shaken during his interview, and he got to the point where he just didn't know how to respond. He couldn't wrap his head around something. And it was really hard, and I believe that's the only interview where they had to say, you know what, let's take a break. And they came back a second time to finish filming the episode. But our guests are people. And these folks can be brilliant actors who work off a script for a movie, that they're acting in. But as people, some folks wrap their head around something quicker than others. Some people, can articulate their thoughts quicker than others. And so often Professor Gates, you know, he'll ask a question and the guest will have to think about it, and then he'll ask the question again or ask it in another way. And Professor Gates is just amazing at eliciting responses that are worthy for television. And so we do work off of the script. Professor Gates is the one in the interview. If I ever was interacting with a guest, it was usually after the interview if they had additional questions. So occasionally I would interface with guests, you know, after the interview just to answer specific questions that might not have been answered.
This is a very distant cousin of mine. It might be yours too, Janice. She's got a question.
It's fun. I have lots of cousins.
I'm not sure if we're like I said, we should figure that out how we'll live. Yeah.
But anyway, my question is how do you choose the celebrities for the program, or do they come to you?
It's a combination. And you would think that there might be some grand design, but it's really, it's interesting. So our producers and the folks at PBS like to think that big ratings are going to come from big A-lister celebrities. And so they might have their wish list. Professor Gates often will rub elbows with somebody on Martha's Vineyard or at some fundraiser or a function, and he'll invite them to be on the show. And sometimes these people are not big-name celebrities, but they're top in their field. Harold Varmus, I'd never heard of Harold Varmus, but he's curing cancer. You know, he's one of the leading scientists in the world. He won a Nobel Prize. But sometimes it's just as capricious as Professor Gates was flying back from Los Angeles to New York or Boston, and who was sitting next to him? Tina Fey. And they strike up a conversation. He says, hey, would you like to be on Finding Your Roots? She ends up as a guest on Finding Your Roots. There was another time when the production team had wrapped up an interview, and they went out to dinner, and somebody else at the restaurant was having a birthday party. And if you've ever been in a restaurant and somebody's having a birthday party, they sing happy birthday, everybody in the whole room joins in. Dr. Phil was at the other table. Professor Gates walks over and introduces himself, says, Dr. Phil, would you like to be on Finding Your Roots? He said, okay. We have no idea who Dr. Phil's ancestors are, like most guests. Chris Wallace, we did Chris Wallace. I'm thinking, all right, we're going to get some Scottish research in. No, Chris Wallace is 100% Ashkenazi Jew. Wallace was originally Wallish. You know, we have no idea where these stories are going to lead until we do the research. But it was just, you know, that ad hoc. It was seeing Dr. Phil at the birthday party in the restaurant.
Let's see, this one. Did you have a question too? Sure, here's a first-time question, and then we'll get to some examples, okay?
I have a question of how you advertise yourself as a genealogist.
Ooh.
Like work
Me
together.
personally?
Yeah, and also just in general, like how
Are you a genealogist who works professionally?
I am.
Okay.
Miriam?
So,
Oh, Becky, okay.
So, how I do it? So, I was very fortunate because when I decided to hang my shingle out, see, can I make a go of this as a professional genealogist? What I'll say is, I had about, I don't know, 20 years of experience doing some family history research, maybe 15 years of pretty serious family history research as an amateur, working mainly on my own family, but also I did some general historical research. I'm interested in the early fur trade of the Pacific Northwest, the early gold mining era, Western Americana. That's my interest. And so I had been very fortunate to travel a lot, and I hit a lot of courthouses and repositories. So I had a lot of experience that most amateur genealogists don't get that breadth of experience. But I didn't have a great depth of experience doing African American research or Jewish research or these other things. So most genealogists specialize. They're very highly specialized in a certain area. So I was very fortunate when I said, we're in Salt Lake City. I have this skill set. I wonder if I could make a go as a professional genealogist. And my wife Chelsea got online. Well, here's somebody who's advertised a while back, and I threw a resume out, sent an email off. This woman wrote back, I didn't even realize that ad was up anymore. And I walked into Johni Cerny's office in Draper, Utah, and after about an hour conversation, she said to me, I've been waiting 20 years for someone like you to walk through this door. Very fortunate. I thought that was a compliment, and it was not. Johni was waiting for somebody to sit down and buckle up and have this bumpy ride because she wanted somebody to show the ropes to, because she knew she wasn't going to carry on forever. And Johni had been with Finding Your African American Lives 1 and 2, which was the precursor to Finding the Roots. And at that point, when I met Johni, we were halfway through season 2, and I watched Finding the Roots. I didn't know that she was the genealogist for Finding the Roots. She didn't become the chief genealogist until I came on board as the associate. We had to figure out what's the pecking order here. Johni had been a captain in the Army, so it was very top-down. We have a chain of command here. But I was very fortunate to have a great mentor. And Johni had a company called Lineages, which had been in business at that point for 30 years. And so I answered phones and I made sales, and we did do private client research. We had other genealogists, some contractors who did some of that research for us. And so my experience in that is very atypical. I kind of came on board in a way that, I don't want to say I kind of rode her coattails, but I came into a system that was already established. And I know that Johni, when she said that when she started out, back in the late 70s and early 80s, it was really hard to make a living as a professional genealogist, full-time. And there was a group of them in Salt Lake City that really tried to make a go of it. And they kind of formed a little consortium, and they, banded together. But at one time, Johni had 50 professional genealogists working for her. Wow. Mostly as independent contractors is kind of the way it works, and Utah's kind of that way. As a business model, a lot of people use contractors instead of employees. But in the genealogy field, it's all the client pays for a certain amount of time. And you do as much as you can in that amount of time. You write a report, and here's your product. No results are guaranteed. You don't know what you're going to find until you go dig in. And once you dig in, you use up the time, and maybe you came up empty. And so, you want your clients to be happy, and you want your clients to reorder. And that's where Johni taught me that, you can't do everything for a client in a 10-hour project or a 20-hour project. And so you give them the best product you can, and in the conclusion you outline where do you go from here. And hopefully you have some clients with deep pockets who keep going, keep going, keep going. And sometimes you have somebody who's just really passionate about family history. Maybe they do some research on their own and they need some help. And they'll save up, and every 6 months or so they'll order another project from you. And so you kind of keep going. So as you build up your clientele, the hope is that people come back and continue. I'm very fortunate in that I made a name for myself very early, immediately in my career. And so I haven't had to, I don't even have a website. And so I haven't had to advertise. So I do have about 6 months of work lined up. But going forward, for me, I'm in the same boat. I have to drum up some business, and you have to have an online presence to do that.
So this young man has another question, and then this young man.
Will Finding Your Roots be interviewing Brad Pitt at any point? I found that we share a 10th grandfather.
Yeah?
Yeah, Robert Pitt, who sailed to America.
Sure.
And, yeah, seriously. He sailed to America on the ship Thunder. And Jim Bridger's great-great-grandfather was Joseph Bridger. And Joseph Bridger is my connection to Robert Pitt, because Joseph Bridger married Robert Pitt's daughter.
I haven't seen Brad Pitt on any of the proposed lists.
And I thought that if they were to do Brad Pitt's, it would help my paycheck.
What I can tell you is, as a professional genealogist, as somebody who's worked for Finding Your Roots, and we find these amazing stories, there are no silver bullets. We don't have any access to any record groups that you don't have access to.
Right.
So we have one here, and then we have another in the back, and we have 15 minutes
Okay.
left. So I'm only going to take new people
Try to get them in.
after this.
This is a very simple illustration of oral history. For a long time, everyone within my clan thought we were part Native American Indian. great-grandfather hated the other great-grandfather, back and forth, and said so, that the other one was part Indian. I had my DNA tested. Not a trace.
Yeah.
0.
Yeah,
Uh,
very common.
So these tests can be very positive and unravel a lot of slander.
I'll speak to that and I'll give you 2 examples. My grandma Betty had a similar story that her great-grandmother, Grandma Forrester, was a quarter Cherokee. So I said, well, if that's true, you should carry about 3% Native American DNA. She took a test, no, 0. Except she had about 3% Sub-Saharan African. And so up the Maggard line, we know that Jacob Maggard's mother was not a Cherokee princess. She was part of a Melungeon community and she was black.
Yeah. Okay, so this young lady in the back.
This is off the thing for this, but I have, my husband's grandfather, great-grandfather were on riverboat captains. And the grandfather was born on a riverboat. Where would you find records for that?
Riverboats?
Riverboats along the Missouri.
So boats going up and down the Missouri River, the Mississippi River, they did not keep records like when they put into a port of call the same way you do as ships coming into the United States from foreign countries. You just don't have boat records. I have seen there are some records, and I want to say they're at Yale University, the Co-Collection of Western Americana. They have some record books of some of the boats, the packet boats that went on the Erie Canal. I've seen records of some of those, but I've never seen records like log books of river boats on the Mississippi and Missouri.
So they wouldn't have like the names of the captains?
No, I've never seen any boat records like manifests or anything like that. My best guess is that you might find some newspaper mentions of the riverboat schedules and who the captain might have been, and maybe some stories. You know, if something noteworthy happened on one of the boats, you might find it in the local paper.
Okay.
Newspaper. That's my best guess.
So our gentleman in the front row's next.
I was just going to ask, I have a grandfather, great-grandfather, and great-great-aunt, I guess, that disappeared, and I cannot figure out where they went. Like my grandfather and my grandmother, great-great, divorced, and he just kind of floated away. And I'm just trying to figure out how to find him.
What I can say is that trying to trace someone forward is more difficult than starting with a known person and tracing them back. So if I start with somebody's death certificate, you get information from the death certificate that might tell you when and where they were born, who their parents were. Now you have an idea of when and where to look for them in earlier records. But when somebody disappears, they don't leave any records that tell you where they went afterward or when or where they died. They could have died in an alley the following week, around the corner. Or they could have gone across the country and changed their name and died 40 years later in another state. And so it's hard. That's the first thing. What you have to do is profile that person as best you can. Get an exact birth date, a name, any aliases, nicknames that they might have used. Find every positive record you can of that person. So you have them up to a certain point. You know, what year did they go AWOL? Then go looking in the next U.S. Census for someone that fits that description. You know, if you have a nice, unusual name, an uncommon name, good luck. If your guy's name is Joe Smith, also good luck. But it's hard. That's hard to do.
Is there a good way to find,
Census.
if I wanted to hire a researcher, how do you find reputable people? What's the best
So
way?
the Association of Professional Genealogists has a website, and that's a great go-to place. Most professional genealogists specialize in either a particular geographic area or with certain ethnic groups or certain types of research. And so, you find somebody who kind of specializes in the area where you're looking. And, if the guy left his family and he's searching the greener pastures, he could have skipped the state and gone who knows where. But you start, you profile that person as best you can, all the positive records you can of the guy. Now you have a profile. go look in the next census for anybody with his name or a similar name, about his age, see how many people you find. You know, if you get 12 people, well, now you have a list of 12 people. Go look for each of them in the previous census when you had your guy. Now you can start scratching off which ones are not your guy, and hopefully you get a shorter list of candidates going forward, unless he changed his name.
Yeah.
If you get a name change, then...
Carlene,
Have you ever ran into some problems in getting documents from New York City?
It depends. New York City has done a wonderful thing. It used to be that you had to write the New York or send somebody to the New York Municipal Archives to get something in person or lick a stamp, send a check in the mail. They have now digitized all of their publicly available birth, death, and marriage records. That doesn't mean that all records are at your fingertips, but whatever records are in the public domain and not restricted are accessible, and it's, I forget the name of the website exactly, it's something like Historical New York, NYC, .com or something like that. But if you go to the New York Municipal Archives website, you should be able to click through and find a link to the genealogical records that are available, and you can search by keyword, names and dates. And the other resource that you can use there is there's a few databases at Ancestry.com and at FamilySearch.org that have indexed birth, death, and marriage records for New York City. And with those, you can get the certificate number. Then you go to the Municipal Archives website and you can look for births in that borough, in that year, look up the certificate number, and boom, pops up digitized image on your screen at your fingertips, download.
Okay.
okay, next question?
Okay, this is more towards DNA.
Yeah.
My grandmother was illegitimate, and we were born in England, and she was illegitimate, so her mother had used her maiden name for my grandmother's name until she remarried. Okay, so there's the question mark, who the father is. I did the ancestor DNA, actually I did all the DNAs on all the platforms just about, including the English one. And I'm coming up with all kinds of first cousins and second cousins, and in Florida, on the Pacific Northwest, all this, and they're all saying, who are you? And I'm going, who are you? I don't know. There is no connection between us. But on the DNA, they have Amish and Mennonites.
Interesting.
From Pennsylvania and in that area. And one of the men apparently went to England, and it was in that time frame, but we haven't been able to find a way to connect. So, do you know the DNA?
Well, the first thing I would suggest, what year was your grandmother born?
1903.
1903. So we're back far enough. Have you ordered and do you have a copy of her birth record?
Yes.
Okay, and it's blank. The father's name is blank. And then when she gets married, she doesn't know her father's name is blank, or she gets sent a stepfather. Okay.
Well,
so,
stepfather, she used his name on hers.
Typical. So the paper trail doesn't give you any clues at all.
No.
So you're on the right track. You're using DNA. What I would suggest you do is, so you tested your own DNA.
Yes.
So you may have some known cousins. These unknown cousins might help you connect the dots, but your known cousins could also help you connect the dots. So down from your grandmother, you're going to have first cousins out there.
One, and he's passed.
Okay, you only have one first cousin, so he can't, and nobody else is in the database. Did he have any children?
He has 2 boys, yes.
Reach out to them and ask them to test DNA. So what you want known relatives who share that common ancestor who has a mystery father. And you want to test your DNA, which you've done, have your known cousins test their DNA. Whoever you match and they match, you're going to start triangulating. You want to find DNA matches that you match and this cousin's children match. It's going to be through your grandmother and grandfather. Those common DNA matches, if you can sort out which ones belong to her husband, those, it's important to know who they are so you can rule out those people as being persons of interest. It's the people that don't connect to your grandfather, you can assume connect through your grandmother and her father. You also need to map out her mother's family tree as well. So any of these DNA matches pop up, if you can connect them to her mother's family tree. Now you're marking off the DNA matches that are not going to be helpful to you solving this mystery, and see who you're left with. Then you try to figure out how they're connected to one another, and you go from there. If you have a Mennonite who went back to England for a short time and was a busy boy during that time, maybe other people are in the same boat. And what's really interesting to me is oftentimes you get in a situation like this, and I've helped some people, my friend and mentor Johni Cerny had, just a friend of the family, twins who were adopted. And I said, yeah, I'll help. And they both tested their DNA, we mapped it all out, and they had so many DNA matches who were in the same boat as they were. And it wasn't that their father was a busy boy, but the men in their father's, biological father's family, the apple didn't fall very far from the tree with this group of guys. And it's interesting that sometimes you find that. And so you may find other people who are in the same situation, and their family tree is as big a mystery as yours. So that's common. Even if it's frustrating, know that you're not alone. But you're on the right track, doing what you're doing. But I would have your cousin's kids test.
So you've got one back here, and then we'll take the gal in the hat. So I'm back here.
I just had a question. How do I find out what orphanages existed in 1963 in Dayton, Ohio?
Ooh. Probably a city directory is going to be a good one. 1963?
Yeah.
So this 1960 and 70 censuses aren't available yet. The 1960 census won't be available until what? 2032? We're a ways off. But whatever orphanages might have existed in 1962 could have existed in 1950. So if you look at a census for Dayton, Ohio, thumbing through the census, you look for an orphanage name at the top of the census page. That might give you an idea. But what I would do is I would call, and we often do this for finding roots. What's our go-to for when we don't have an answer for something very specific like that? I will call the public library in Dayton, Ohio, and I will talk to a reference librarian. And I will say, what orphanages existed in Dayton, Ohio in 1962? And they will say, I'm not sure, but the president of our local historical society might have an answer for you. The president of our local genealogical society might have an answer for you. And I can't tell you how many times, finding your roots, we need something very specific like that, and we reach out, and somebody local who has this very specific local knowledge helps solve a mystery because they know what records are available. They know what orphanages were active at that time. So reach out to somebody in Dayton. The city directory is probably going to be the most helpful. But when you're getting into the 1960s, the city directories, start waning in the 60s and 70s. You don't get those great city directories like you do back, decades earlier. But call the library. Call the local genealogical society, call the, or send an email out to the local genealogical society. And I can tell you in Ohio, a lot of those local county genealogical societies are very active and great people to work with.
Okay, we've got a guest in here with a salmon-colored hat, I think. Maybe. Oh, maybe. Oh, excuse me.
We came to a dead end finding my mother. We found the father and siblings and cousins. Is it a good idea to do testing with other companies to see if there's any DNA with another sibling or anything that can find another?
So were you adopted or, okay. So if you're adopted, you have a parent, one parent that's unknown, or both parents or biological parents are unknown, absolutely test across the board. And what I suggest is if you tested Ancestry and you tested 23andMe, although Google 23andMe and see what's going on right now. Those two sites you have to pay to test there. But if you've tested at Ancestry or 23andMe, you can download your raw DNA and then upload it to Family Tree DNA, MyHeritage, GenMatch. There's other databases that you can download your raw DNA. You don't have to pay to retest, but you may have to pay to unlock some tools, but it's a lot cheaper. You get more bang for your buck that way.
Well, would that be
Yes.
a good
Yes.
forward?
Yes, absolutely. So the more databases you're in, the better chance you have of matching somebody who might have only tested that other database. Because somebody might have tested at 23andMe and nowhere else. Somebody might have tested at MyHeritage or Family Tree DNA and nowhere else. And so, absolutely, get your DNA in as many databases as possible. And then GenMatch is one where you can't test there, you just upload your raw DNA, but it's kind of a clearinghouse. And they have a lot more tools too. You can lower the threshold and find more distant cousins. But if you're trying to identify, biological parents and close relatives, some of those tools are going to be less helpful because they're, the more distant cousins aren't going to help you connect the dots.
But the more, that more information leads you to a lot more.
But you have a better chance of finding a half-sibling or a first cousin who's tested one place and nowhere else. So there's that.
We have time for one more question.
Make it good.
And I want to make sure that you all know that there are a bunch of cousins here rooting for our cousin. So our cousins drove over from Seattle today. Their great-grandmother was the sister of my grandfather. So we have
We're friends on Facebook.
cousins and cousins. But we have time for one more question today. Yes.
I want to ask about adoption records from the 1920s and earlier. Have any of the states opened those up?
Yeah.
California?
I'm not sure about California. It changes every year. The legislature might pass a bill. So it's really hit or miss depending what state it is, whether or not those adoption records have been categorically open or how it works exactly. In Arizona, for instance, even though all the adoptions are sealed, you can still hire someone, and they're kind of like a ad litem, they're like a go-between. They can access the records that you can't. They're not allowed to tell you any detailed information, but they can reach out to, or try to track down, reach out to the biological parents. Ask them, do you want to be in touch? And if they say yes, you're in. If they say no, they'll let you know. And so every state has its own rules, and it just really depends where it was. If it's California, just, you find out what's going on in California right now. But what I can tell you is, on Facebook, there are Facebook groups that are dedicated to that. Tens of thousands of people. And you can ask a question. They have gone down this same rabbit hole, and they will have very specific answers for you, depending what state it is. And when you're talking about specific adoption agencies, they all have different policies. You have some states that you have a choice whether it's an open adoption or a closed adoption. You don't know. But some states, they're all closed adoptions. And so to get those records unsealed through a court order is practically impossible. They're just not going to do it unless there's a very compelling, usually a compelling legal reason. It can't be curiosity, or I just want to know, or I don't know about my medical history. So what I say there is find someone who specializes in that specific area, and they will have the answers for you.
So Cousin Nick, I lost somebody that didn't get to ask their question.
Okay.
Would you all be willing to listen to one more question?
Yes.
Okay. What's your question?
Oh, thank you. Would you please comment on your personal process that you go through when you get a project? Are there certain things that you say, I'm going to do this first, this second, this third, or just like what's your process?
Okay, so I'll give you two different processes. So for finding your roots, or if somebody came to me and says, I want to know everything there is to know about my family tree, you start with a questionnaire. What do you already know? You start with the known and go into the unknown. Once you profile, you're starting with your own family tree. What do you know? Who are your parents? Who are your grandparents? Great-grandparents? Where did they live? When did they live? Get a birth date, a death date. You want to do a census survey. You want to get a U.S. census for every year that person was alive, every 10 years. Sometimes there's a state census, it just depends on the state, and those are kind of hit or miss, what states kept state censuses. And then you want to get every vital record, usually a birth certificate, if they were born when birth certificates were issued, death certificate, marriage certificates. If they were married more than once, you get every marriage. World War I and World War II draft cards for men. Those have great information. Sometimes that's the only record that will give you an exact birth date or a birthplace for immigrants, the immigrant generation. They immigrated in 1910. They were of age. They had to register for that World War I draft. And then in 1942, 44, there were like 6 or 7 different drafts during World War II. It started out, anybody in 1940, anybody who was 18 to 35. And then 42, anybody who had turned 18 to 20 in those previous 2 years. But then they had the old man's draft, because these are guys that aren't going to see active service, but they wanted to have an idea of men who were still working age in the the United States in the workforce. So World War II draft cards can give you exact birth dates for men who were much older than you would have thought might have needed to register for the draft. What other records? Social Security number application forms are great ones. Say somebody was born before birth certificates were issued, or for some reason you can't find a birth certificate for this person. They got married in a place that didn't ask for their parents' names on the marriage certificate. What other record? When they died, the informant didn't know their parents' names. What other record are you going to get their parents' names? When somebody applied for a Social Security number, the form says, where are you born, exact date. Well, when are you born, where are you born in? What are your parents' names? And so you get from the person themselves who their parents were. If they knew their parents, that's another record. And that's Social Security Administration's Form SS5. And you can order those if the person's been dead. If either the person's been dead or they were born more than 100 or 110 years ago, you can get that. So you try to get those record groups. Then if you want to do a deep dive and you know where they live, go to newspapers.com or newspaper archives and just search for their name in the local newspaper. And so that process is census survey, vital records. If you want to do a little broader search, you search for siblings as well. Find all of the censuses and all of the vital records for the siblings of your ancestors. It gives you a little more information about the whole family group, and sometimes that gives you a better idea of who the family was, but especially when you get to the immigrant generation, it can be very helpful to find some tidbit of information and take it back to the old country. And so when you start from scratch and you're doing the whole pedigree, you want to just get every census and every vital record, and there's a few other key records that you want to get. If it looks like somebody might have been the age they could have served in World War I, World War II, the Civil War, then there's go-to places to see if those records, any war records might survive. But when I do research for a private client, it's whatever the client's goals are. If they're hiring you and they're paying you for your time, what are your goals, what are your objectives, and you really have to focus on that for the client. And so, my method there is, what do you want to know? And I ask the clients to form your goals in the form of a question you want me to try to answer. And so that way you're very targeted in trying to answer that question. Then for finding your roots, it's a combination of the two. We're doing somebody's entire pedigree. That's just the nuts and bolts, the censuses, the vital records, and your census, newspaper surveys, a few other draft cards and things like that. You profile who were the people, when were they born, when did they die, where did they live, and now you're in a position to do those deep dives. And if the question comes up, well, did this person, have military service? Was this person a slaveholder? You have very specific questions like that. Then you can do a deeper dive to try to find those record groups. If the people are African American, and the question is, who was the slaveholder? That's a critical question you have to answer if you want to delve into the slave era records, because all the records are going to be attached to the slaveholder. Then you have to do very focused research, and you have to know very specifically where they were from, what county they're in order to focus the search for those records. So if you find the basic records, the nuts and bolts or censuses and vital records, then you profile the people and you know where they lived when, and that allows you to focus research for the types of records that might give you interesting stories or put a little meat on the bones when you're doing your family history. Because, you know, a lot of us, if you document your family tree, it's just names and dates. How meaningful is that? Unless you have an idea of who these people were and what made them tick. And I've even had clients who wanted to know, like, what were my ancestors' favorite foods? You know, that was not a question in 1926. You know, I think you can figure that one out. And so there are some questions like that that you're not going to find in any public records. However, in genealogy research, one of the joys of learning new information is connecting with other researchers, cousins. And I would say one of the most important things you can do if you're starting out is to talk to your relatives. If you have grandparents, aunts or uncles, older cousins, they may have heard family stories that you never heard. And some of those family stories might tell you something about your ancestors that you'll never find in the public record. Or they might give you some little tidbit of information that will allow you to focus your research in order to find the records that tell you who your earlier ancestors were. You know, sometimes you just have a brick wall or an anomaly, or this person fell out of the sky. And, you know, where do we search for them? And some cousin heard some story that gives you the key. Or they have the family Bible. My Grandma Betty knew I was into family history. My Grandma Betty loved family history, yet I had no idea she had the family Bible from John Forrester and Martha Elizabeth Maggard, who were pioneer vintners in Napa Valley. And my Aunt Janet's going to send it to me, she said. So, fantastic. So, if you reach out to cousins, you reach out to some relatives, you can share what you know, they share what they know, and you can collaborate and maybe ask them to test DNA.
So I want to thank you all. Let me interrupt you. I want to thank you all for coming today. I want to thank KSPS, PBS. I'd also like to thank Westerners Spokane Corral. How many people in the room know what Westerners Spokane Corral is or are members? We've got a bunch of the members in the room. What this is for the rest of you that are in the room is people that love history, just like this. And that's why we brought Cousin Nick today. It turns out he's right. We're all related somehow. So that's what we should do, is get along. But